Right, so welcome, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this IETA European Climate Summit. My name is Frédéric Simon. I'm a journalist at Carbon Pulse, and I will be your host for today's session, which is titled The Case for Credits and Claims, Navigating the EU Policy Framework. Now, during this session, we'll be looking at recent policy developments in Europe when it comes to carbon credits and claims, and then we'll exchange notes about what this means for companies who want to make such claims. And so now, just to give a brief overview, there are three pieces of legislation which have been adopted or are currently in the pipeline in the European Union that you should be aware of. First is a directive on empowering consumers for the green transition. Then there's a Green Claims Directive and a carbon removal certification framework. Now, these three pieces of legislation are supposed to work in lockstep. So first one, on consumers, basically tells companies what is not allowed when it comes to communicating messages to consumers. There is, for example, this ban on carbon neutral claims that are based entirely on offsetting schemes, so that is no longer allowed. The Green Claims Directive, on the other hand, regulates the types of marketing messages that will continue being allowed, and so it requires companies, for example, to make sure environmental claims are verified by third-party certifiers and backed by scientific evidence before they can put them in front of consumers. And then there's the carbon removal certification framework. This is probably the most innovative piece of legislation there, because it sets up the world's first registry for carbon removals and defines concretely which types of activities will be eligible to obtain a carbon removal credit. Now, we don't know yet where those credits will be traded, whether it's on the EU ETS or in a separate market. That will be up to the European Commission to make a proposal in this regard. And then there are still missing pieces, like the specific methodologies that are currently being developed for the carbon removals themselves, like direct air capture, for example, or carbon farming. What we do know, though, is that the removal credits will be eligible for use in meeting the EU's decarbonisation objectives, and that is something that was made explicit in the political agreement on the carbon removal certification framework. So that's the overview, but like I said, there are still some moving parts. The Green Claims Directive, for instance, has not been adopted yet. We're still at first reading stage. The European Parliament has taken first reading, but the Council still has to vote on it. And then the first methodologies for the carbon removal certification framework, they're being adopted as we speak. They're being elaborated, but the first ones are not expected to become law until summer 2025 at the earliest. So still quite a bit of uncertainty there and moving parts. And of course, there's also now the wider political context. So as you know, there's European elections, which are taking place in June. And following that, there will be a new commission that will be appointed. And according to all the projections that we've seen so far, well, it turns out that the new parliament that will emerge from these elections is expected to be a lot more right-wing than the current one. And so that means probably a commission that will itself become more right-wing because it needs the backing of the parliament to be confirmed. And so probably it also means a commission that is going to be slightly less interested in climate policy than its predecessor, with a focus more on implementation of the agreed policies, which, you know, we're looking forward to the targets for 2030, and that has already been made quite clear by the current Commission that the focus will be a lot on implementation. So that's for the broad picture, and now to discuss these moving parts and this evolving regulatory framework, let me call on stage our panelists, starting with Esme Brandon. She's a low carbon regulatory affairs manager at BP. Welcome, Esme. We have Jennifer Jenkins. She's Chief Sustainability Officer at Rubicon Carbon. Then Giorgio Berry, UK and European Policy Lead at Patch. And finally, René Velasquez. He's Managing Partner at Valiterra. So thanks to all of you for being with us today. We'll have about an hour in front of us. We also want to make this an interactive session, so we'll have microphones circulating in the room, and we'll take questions from the audience towards the end of the session. So please raise your hand, and we'll take some of those. So now to get the conversation started. Switch to this microphone. Fantastic, it even works. To get the conversation going, I'll ask basically the same question to each one of you. We're seeing this regulatory framework for credits and claims in the European Union being shaped up right now as we speak. From what we've seen so far, what are the things that you like and the things you don't like? And Esme Brandon, maybe you can start.
Thank you for inviting me here today. I start off with giving you just a bit of an introduction to me. So I'm the Regulatory Affairs Manager for or one of our Regulatory Affairs Managers for our low carbon solutions business in our trading and shipping business. So we are focused on being a face to market for BP for carbon markets. And my role is looking at the regulatory landscapes that enable the compliance and compliance and voluntary markets that we're involved in. As a trading business, we have been for a long time involved in European compliance markets because of our footprint in Europe. We've also been involved in voluntary markets for a long time as well. So with regards to the landscape that's developing in Europe on claims, I think we're very supportive of the development of legislation that is looking at tackling consumer protection and is looking at ensuring that that we don't have unfair commercial practices. We are trying to, we want to see the development of increased transparency and accountability in how companies are making environmental claims. And I think it's really important to say that supportive legislation and guidance is critical for companies like ours when it comes to things like the climate financing that is required to enable everyone to sort of get to the Paris Agreement goals. And when we're looking at net zero and goals that companies are putting in place, having the guidance and steering around how we get there is really important. We are very supportive of the transparency, as I said, but particularly in reference to the voluntary market and voluntary use of carbon credits with regards to environmental claims. And as you say, this is an evolving landscape, and what that guidance looks like is yet to be seen. So we are watching this very closely.
Okay, thank you. Jennifer Jenkins, your views briefly about this evolving landscape, things you like about it maybe, and things you like less.
Thank you. Briefly. So yeah, I'm Jen Jenkins. I'm Chief Science Officer for Rubicon Carbon. Just a few notes about Rubicon. We were founded in late 22. Our parent is the TPG Rise Climate Equity platform. We're a sort of an intermediary, right? We're in between buyers and sellers of credits. We make investments, and we also package our credits into portfolios that buyers can purchase in order to help them meet their net zero goals. You know, I think there's some positive things happening in the market right now, and then there's some sort of less positive things happening, especially in the regulatory and sort of legislative realms. And I will just preface this. Renee and I have a deal. I'm going to use a little bit of his time if I can. Renee's a trader, and we made a little trade. So you may change your mind when you get to the end, but. You know, I think, so there are efforts afoot in the market to improve quality and integrity, right? We really support the ICVCM and the core carbon principles. We support the VCMI and the Claims Code of Practice, VERA and its updated RED Plus methodologies. I think all of these are really, really positive developments, and we're moving from, in a way, VCM 1.0 to VCM 2.0. Those are all really, really positive developments. You know, not only that, right? SBTI made an announcement last week that they're sort of willing to accept credits for Scope 3 targets in some cases. And so, you know, I feel like that's also a very, very positive and welcome development. There are risks, though. And the risks, you know, I think what's happening is the negative media narrative is spilling over into the rooms and policymaking forums. And so what we're seeing is the passage of rules that have the potential to chill the market, you know, and thereby limit the climate action that the market can provide. So intervention is badly needed in a few particular very specific places, and I'll just list them very briefly here at a high level, and can go into any one of them ad nauseum, probably more than you want, but if detail is needed. So the issue of compensation versus contribution claims, we're not going to scale the market on contribution. Philanthropy is not how we're going to get there. We need to have compensation claims. That needs to be really clear. Emissions reductions versus removals. We're not going to get to net zero without nature. We absolutely need to continue investing in avoided emissions, particularly from tropical forest places. Permanence and the like-for-like principle. You know, I think that's okay. It's a little limited. It's a lot limited. There is work to try to create more permanent versions of some of the less permanent solutions. Can go into that. Residual emissions, the definition of residual needs to be clarified. In my view, it should just be remaining unabated emissions. We can talk about that. And I also think, you know, carbon neutrality claims have been sort of rendered not legal, right, per the Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition Directive for products. But let's explicitly say that carbon neutrality claims are okay at the enterprise level. I think that's also important. That's what I've got.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. It wasn't too long in the end, and you raised some very important points, so we'll definitely go deeper into those later in the discussion. So let me turn now to Georgia Berry. Your thoughts about this evolving regulatory landscape.
Thank you. Also, just to start with who I am and who I work for Patch, which is an American-based software company, which ultimately is about trying to bring transparency and efficiency to the voluntary carbon market. So we believe that by really supporting rapid growth in transparency and, as I say, sort of making it more efficient, modernizing how transactions occur, we can build scale in this much needed market. I lead on the UK and EU policy, which is actually just quite fascinating in itself, as two quite distinct worlds now. But coming to the EU and what's happening, I mean, I'd say first off, you know, seriously impressed by what the EU has taken on, because we've gone from a world where the EU has been at the lead with the EU ETS, and sort of that's obviously a compliance market, incredibly impressive. But there's been a considerable amount of skepticism towards voluntary carbon markets at EU level. And I think the fact that they've got on board with or said, right, we're actually just going to try and develop the most comprehensive regulatory framework for this voluntary carbon market does need to be lauded, and really sort of, you know, understand kind of how complex that is. What I would say, though, is we have to find a balance. And I think what we're seeing, and perhaps what sort of Jen has also just mentioned, is that if you go too far with regulation, you regulate everything from the outset, you can really stymie what is still a nascent market, despite the fact that it's been around for quite a long time. So our take is that this is not a mandatory market, as we all know. There are no requirements to be involved in it. we need to think very, very carefully about not quashing this market and stalling it, and thinking about the sticks, the carrots, the incentives, and supporting people to enter into the market whilst providing the transparency and trust that we all know is needed.
Okay, thank you. René, do you want to say a few words, or have you traded your speaking time definitely?
Well, I'll ask Jen, do I have any time back from that trade? We'll do a swap deal. But I think it was a worthwhile investment, obviously, giving you that extra time. Thank you for laying that out, Jen. I really appreciate that. So just a little bit of context. My name is René Velasquez. I lead a business called Valaterra. We just launched this week. We provide advisory and carbon trading services to companies to help them to navigate the increasing complexity in these markets. We leverage experience from infrastructure development across registries and exchanges and trading and brokerage. I think the ladies here have said lots of really important components here. I just want to pick some of them. Jen, with regards to your point, yes, there has been a chilling effect with regards to the exclusion of carbon neutral claims for products, but it is really important to stress that point that you made, that does not apply at the enterprise level, right? And so it's looking at the purpose of these restrictions effectively is to avoid for greenwashing as it relates to products and the behavior of consumers. But there's still a huge component in terms of the market from the enterprise side of things. And that's, to your point, Georgia, we should laud the regulators for looking at this and in order to regulate this market, to give it additional credibility, but we have to strike that balance. And so, you don't want to over-regulate the market, if I can oversimplify that. But it's a reaction that's natural because of the evolving nature of our market. Historically, it was binary, it was compliance and/or, or voluntary, and now it's and/or, essentially. So we have this interoperability, as we all know here, with regards to other markets, and I think it's just a natural evolution. So those are the other sort of color comments I would like to add.
René, maybe let me stay with you. Sure. So you're talking about these regulatory initiatives saying you don't want to stifle the market. So it's a bit of a two-edged sword, right? Because on the one hand, companies don't want to have too many constraints, and it's a nascent market, and you don't want to stimulate it. On the other hand, also given the challenges that we've seen currently on the voluntary market, regulation does bring some certainty, some predictability. So do you see there some welcome elements, or like something that the industry could also look forward to have that kind of certainty from regulators as well? And René, you can answer.
Do you want me to begin, or
Jen wants to?
Looks like you want to say something. I'm happy to speak to you again.
I do.
Jump in, go for it.
So,
keep doing swaps.
You're going to get tired of hearing from me at the end of this. I do. Yes, regulation is good. A compliance market would be even better, right? Coming from the U.S. perspective, that's something that we're sort of, would always love, but are not likely to see. I don't think the extent of it feels a little bit like, to some extent, the Parliament and the Commission have been reinventing the wheel, right? I guess we have the VCMI, right? The VCMI has a good definition of residual emissions. The VCMI has a claims code of practice. It almost feels as though the Parliament and somebody's not talking to the Parliament and educating them about what's already happening in the market. If we're concerned about quality, we have the ICVCM. There are, stakeholders have been spending, months of their time really digging in great detail to quantify and set out what good looks like in terms of a good carbon credit. So we have all of those things, right? And to some extent, for the EU to then regulate and come up with a whole new system that sort of is parallel to that seems just sort of unnecessary.
Okay. René?
Yeah, no, I picked that up from Jen. I think it's rather counterintuitive if it's separate, right? But I think that there's an opportunity here for that collaboration and intersection. And I think from a regulatory perspective, if you kind of break it down, and to your point, Frederick, you don't want to have it to be constraining. Essentially, they're guardrails, and they are welcome, right? Because they create essentially the level playing field. We don't want actors effectively to act in nefarious ways. We want them to act in credible ways. And I think building on the foundational elements that Jen just outlined of all the really incredible work, and I just add to that, IETA's just coming out right today. I don't want to sort of preface too much, but the next panel is going to be discussing it around the guidelines for the use of high integrity carbon credits, and then how that dovetails and works well with regards to the claims. And so I think ultimately, what I think the solution is transparency. Right? So it comes down to the transparency, because that ultimately begets trust in the market. And I think that then can appease, let's say, the regulatory concerns around the use of offsets as a sort of a get-out-of-jail card. I don't think anyone's saying that, and I think to then piggyback and final comment here, but on to Jen's comment about SBTI and the potential opening up here for Scope 3 use of EACs, is that it all integrates, right? It's around the use of high carbon credits effectively to be able to meet these targets, but by no means does it mean that companies are not expected to decarbonize and reduce their emissions internally. I think that we want to set that on the table again to make sure that there's no misinterpretation, right?
Yeah. This is obviously one of the big fears and risks. Georgia Berry, you seem to have a little bit more sympathy for the regulators here than the two other panelists we just heard. So do you believe there is value in what the regulators are doing now to, bringing certainty to this market, which is going through a bit of a difficult period at the moment?
Yes, I suppose it's critical to remember the context in which the CRC, the Carbon Removal Certification Framework, came about, and there are very real concerns at European level around greenwashing, and that it was coming from a place largely motivated by tackling greenwashing, and also, we won't go into this now, but a separate question on channeling funding into carbon farming. So if we think about where it came from, I do have I don't know if it's empathy, but I have an understanding of why they have taken on this task. I equally would say that I completely agree with Jen and with Renee about not reinventing the wheel, not setting up multiple regional systems that can't communicate, looking to the best practice guidance that has been produced by incredibly impressive stakeholders over a long period of time. And none of us know exactly how the actual implementation of the CRCF will happen. That's all largely in the hands of delegated acts. But my hope and my optimism is that, as opposed to reinventing the wheel, in reality, policymakers will look to this best practice, whether you're talking methodology, production, or whether you're talking, what is high integrity, and they will really just draw on those guidelines and incorporate them into the CRCF. So that's my hope. So if that answers.
Okay, absolutely. Esme Brandon, maybe a practical question. So with this regulatory framework which is being adopted, from what we've seen so far, do you think it's going to make it easier or harder for BP to reach its decarbonisation objectives?
Well, I think one of the, again, looking at where some of this legislation has sort of come from, I think it's really important that the EU legislation allows companies to be able to make environmental claims, but does so in a way that meets the underlying objectives of things like the Green Claims Directive. I think it's really important that companies want to do the right thing. A lot of companies have put net zero targets in place, and they want to have clarity around how they can go about doing those things. And if without having clear guidance and clear guardrails around what they can do, then they're not going to invest. They're not going to act in this space. And it's particularly important when it comes to things like carbon credits. And as has been said by others on the panel, there's been a lot of work done to try and tackle some of the challenges in the voluntary carbon space. I think when it comes to the legislation that's being developed at the moment, the key question kind of comes back to what are the enabling frameworks that can be put in place to give companies the opportunity to make the investments and to make action in a multitude of different ways. I hope that kind of answers the question.
in a multitude of different ways at the same time? Because, you know, like we heard, there is also this question of, you know, should companies be allowed at one point only, you know, after they've been decarbonizing sufficiently to be using carbon credits, you know, just to tackle these residual emissions. So do you believe there is a point at which the company should be allowed to make use of those, and, you know, and not allowed in the first place, right?
I mean, given the size of the climate challenge that we've got in front of us, and given the different, you know, different companies, different decarbonization pathways that people have, I think you should be governments should be trying to enable companies to do whatever they can, as much as they can, alongside reduction activities. Mm-hmm. So companies will have decarbonization agendas. They will have trajectories that they're doing, and they should be able to, if they want to, and have the guide rails to do it.
Yeah, so you're saying both at the same time is for you works fine. Jennifer, is that your opinion as well?
Yeah, I mean, and the evidence actually shows that companies that use credits actually are more likely to have to make progress, to be making more progress on their internal decarbonization than companies that don't. There have been at least 3 or 4 studies in the last 12 months that have demonstrated that. So I think it is an all of the above strategy, and, you know, frankly, we don't have time to sort of mess around with, you know, trying to get everything absolutely perfect. We really need to just act and do it now.
René?
Thanks, Jen. You took both of my comments. No, completely agree. I was just going to say to Esme, well, let's also raise it. There's an urgency component, let's be quite frank, right? And so just, you know, throwing sand in the gears, as some folks view it, or slowing down the action is just not an option. We need to have the guardrails, fine, but we also need to encourage action, because corporates are driven in large part, right, by multiple sort of inputs, right? But stakeholders, a key component. But risk is another key component, right? And so many of them are effectively waiting because they're afraid to take action because they feel that they could be reprimanded for it, right? And these systems we talked about actually help to encourage. If just the regulators could actually speak to one another with the private industry, it would be great.
Can I add one more comment? I think that's a really important point, because the alternative for these companies is to simply exit the market and do nothing.
Just inaction. We've seen it. It's
right,
chilling in that perspective. And when I speak to sustainability managers on a regular basis, they just say, look, we don't want to be the first one out there and then have our name in the print media. So essentially, we know it's hypocritical, and we know we've made these commitments, but we're not really going to do anything about it. And that's just depressing, quite frankly. And they're willing to allocate capital, and it's at scale, to actions and activities that actually reduce and remove carbon at scale. Why are we preventing them from doing so?
Georgia or Esme, you wanted to add something on this topic?
Yes, I thought it just might be helpful to give an insight into 3 patterns that we've seen over the last sort of 6 months in particular in terms of corporate response to what's been going on at EU level. And it's really kind of fallen into 3 categories amongst our customers. We've got those who are already who've been on the edge for a while, slightly teetering, wondering about how to enter into the VCM. And on the whole, those guys have just paused. They've, exactly as you said, you know, there's been a sort of stalling, and they have said, you know what, it's just not worth our while right now. There's too many question marks. And of course, from our perspective, that is a real risk, because they're going to be badly positioned in terms of procurement, understanding, budgeting, etc., for when this market scales.
And these would be regulated industries, probably under the EU ETS?
Yeah, both
Yeah.
actually, both. Right. So, but mostly, you know, voluntary. So those who would possibly just do this for other reasons. So that's sort of one bucket. Another bucket we've seen has been the heavier emitters, who would be impacted impacted by the like-for-like principle, whereby their residual emissions, however one interprets that or wherever we get to with that wording and language, would be considerable. And therefore, they suddenly are in a very different economic bracket in terms of what they would be having to invest in from a carbon credit perspective, because you're looking at permanent removals, and of which, A, they're very expensive, but B, there isn't necessarily sufficient amount of them. Yeah. So we've had that feedback. And then the third sort of bucket are the expert buyers. And these are the kind of more sustainability leaders who are, to Jen's point, those who in the survey already decarbonizing considerably, are already active in this market. They're interesting because they're less worried. They say sort of along the lines of, do you know what, we're just going to carry on doing what we're doing. We know we're doing it for the right reasons. We're doing it for positioning, for getting to grips with this market, for understanding pricing. We want to continue learning. We're not necessarily going to be making carbon neutral claims off the back of this. We're going to be telling different stories. So that's our sort of 3 buckets, really, of response we've seen.
Okay.
Can I add one other bucket?
Sure. Just go ahead, René.
Just to stir the pot, but I completely agree. I mean, in terms of distribution, that's the folks that we speak to. But there are folks that we don't speak to. So I'd like to add another bucket to that list, if you'll indulge me. But of folks that just are not considering it right now because it's too hot to handle, quite frankly. And so, that's an opportunity for our market to help to encourage participation.
Right, yeah. And they might simply decide not to do it at all. René and Jen, actually, I think you both insisted on the need for transparency. And that is something where maybe regulators can help. Where do you think a good balance can be found between, how regulators can maybe, set rules in place that actually not just encourage, but make it mandatory for the transparency to be there, and at the same time encourage people to get on the market. Where can this kind of balance be found, Jen?
Yeah. So obviously we're based in the U.S., right? So I can take a U.S. lens. I think disclosure is important, right? Transparent disclosure is critical. It's, as has already been said, right? It's sunlight, it brings sunlight, which is never a bad thing. The Securities and Exchange Commission in the U.S. has just released, and unfortunately now it's in court, so they've stayed it, so it's not actually effective yet. But that was, I thought, a very good compromise in terms of, requiring companies that had a goal to disclose their emissions and then disclose any material utilization of carbon credits that they might have employed to help sort of compensate for those emissions. Now, there are problems with that, right? It didn't require scope 3 for important reasons, and it's only applicable to companies that actually have a goal, right? So in a way, it almost disincentivizes anyone from having a goal, because as long as you don't have a goal, you don't have to disclose. There are rules in California, actually, that do include scope 3 that have just been now made final and sort of are active. And those are great, right? So I think there's definitely a role for disclosure. And I guess sort of placing limits on what companies can do with credits is sort of where, or placing new limits, right? Placing regulated limits aside from what's already enshrined in VCMI and ICVCM. That is sort of where I, sort of draw the line.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Others want to react about the mandatory
can I add to
transparency reporting?
Sorry, could I add to that? Just because Jen's point is absolutely prescient. So in the US, it's obviously with the SEC, it's in court, but it's on court for both sides for not being stringent enough, including scope 3 and for being too onerous in another way. But I think you're absolutely correct. I think California is a really great example for the EU to potentially follow. If you'll indulge me, I'd like to read the transparent disclosure in use of carbon credits language that IETA has just published. It's one paragraph. So it says, companies should publicly and transparently disclose their use of carbon credits. This includes disclosure of quantities and details about the carbon credits that have been retired by the company within a reporting year. This should include project name, type, vintage, location, the program and methodology under which the credits were issued, purpose of retirement, link to registry retirement listing, and any relevant due diligence measures undertaken. I think that's the guideline, right? If we're answering the question directly. It's just transparency. 101, this information is available on the registries, and good corporate actors already do this in terms of best practice. Codifying that wouldn't hurt.
Okay. You agree with this, Esme? Making those kinds of rules mandatory? Seems there's pretty wide backing for that.
Well, like I said at the beginning in our intro, transparency, I think, is fundamental in this market. And you know, as a corporate, we're already subject to corporate sustainability disclosure requirements in different parts of the world. So we already we will comply with those sort of rules and regulations that are put in place where we're operating. Yes, transparency is something that we'd be very supportive of, and I think a lot of companies in this space would agree.
Jen, one question for you, because we heard about these different types of credits, the permanent ones and the less permanent ones, the high integrity ones. What are the best practices? Because you know this market, you operate it on a daily basis. What are the best practices when it comes to encouraging high integrity credits?
We've already talked about the ICVCM. I actually really like the Oxford offsetting principles, even the revised version, because it does give, it helps companies to see the sort of the range of options out there, right? The different types of credits. Some are, emissions with storage, emissions without, emissions reductions with storage, emissions reductions without storage, temporary storage, long-term, sort of permanent storage. It sort of gives it's a handy guide, sort of a how-to to the range of credits that are out there. And it also doesn't sort of, it enables compensation claims, right, while acknowledging that 90% of the credits in the market today are these nature-based sort of emissions reductions, and that the permanent, and it also acknowledges and sort of lays out a coherent intentional strategy for moving from the offsetting using sort of these temporary and temporary storage emissions reductions credits all the way over to the sort of longer term permanent removals, which are frankly right now not available and too expensive for widespread use. And so, if to the extent we can enshrine those, and we do at our firm, we refer to them whenever we can, I think that would be a step forward for the market.
Others want to react on this? I mean, this is something that we've seen from the Commission side with the carbon removal certification framework, that they have the intention, it seems, to prioritize the most permanent form of removals, but those obviously are the ones which are the least available. Georgia.
I suppose the one comment we would make, and I think, also agreed that all types are really, really critical, but just on your question of kind of what's the best standard, what should everybody follow, I think, and this is obviously a role that Patch really tries to play, but is a role that is critical, is that education and interpretation role between the guidance and actually making a purchase, a company actually getting involved in the market, because we, as you say, spend every single day in this market, and the guidance at times can be quite high level. It doesn't necessarily speak in language that translates into, language that everybody understands, and I think that is a key missing part. And you need intermediaries really to still bring people into the market despite having the guidance, because they're quite removed from it. But in the longer term, I would say ultimately where we, ideally from our perspective, where you get to is an alignment around scientific guidance, because we do have multiple options at the moment, and trying to consolidate as best as possible will hopefully make this a more transparent and easier to access market.
Okay, I'll stay with you, Georgia, about the use of credits by companies and the claims they can make. So in which areas do you think they still need clarity, potentially, from the regulators, both on the demand and on the supply of credits?
You said by country. Do you mean by companies? Sorry, did I miss
it?
Yeah, sorry, by companies. I think this is the really sort of nitty-gritty part in terms of, coming back to the earlier point, this is not a mandated sector, so companies do not have to do this. If you make it too difficult for them to do it, and you don't provide a clear pathway for how they enter and how they can talk about what they're doing, you are going to put in place barriers. I think without going into the nitty-gritty of the EU policy of where it is right now, what we're really seeing at EU level is a disconnect between two of the directives, between the CRCF and the Green Claims Directive, because ultimately the carbon removal certification framework is an enormous stamp of approval from the EU saying to corporates, get involved, like, we really want you to do this, we need the money, we want to scale, we're putting huge resource behind developing this, go for it sort of thing. And then you have the Green Claims Directive, which says almost the absolute opposite, and also does not align with Oxford, with the other guidance coming out. It's early days. The Green Claims is not a done deal, as we know, so I think that's why I don't want to dwell on it too much. But I would just say it leaves multiple questions, far more questions than it answers, and they do need to be resolved if you don't want to close those doors.
So now, turning on to the criticism as well, because we've heard a lot of the NGOs becoming more vocal about credits and claims, and basically making the point that the companies should first reduce emissions before we even consider doing removals and getting a market for that. You can see that this is something that is going to grow in importance, whether you like it or not, but it seems like this is a debate which is gaining traction in Brussels. How do you think this industry or this ecosystem can help convince the NGOs that that they're not trying to be, that you're not trying to fool them, in a sense, because I can see this thing becoming very confrontational, very quickly. So what kind of arguments can you put in front of them to appease them, to mollify them? Jen.
Yeah, there are, I guess I sort of will push back a little bit on the characterization that all NGOs are opposed to markets, because that's not the case. There are some very large sort of forward-thinking, forward-looking NGOs that recognize the value, that believe in climate action, right? And recognize that in the absence of worldwide compliance markets, we actually do need a mechanism, a practical, workable mechanism to get corporates engaged. And in large part, what we're seeing is, many of the carbon projects are taking place in geographies where investment is difficult and action is necessary, action is needed, and action isn't happening because, just frankly, the investment is not there, right? And so I think the NGOs that I talk with, and there are many of them, actually really support the idea that this can be a mechanism to get funding from the global north to the global south. It's the only thing we've got right now. Governments aren't going to do it. They haven't, right? And so the private sector is here willing. They've got capital. They're ready to step up. Let's make it easy for them, not hard.
Okay, Renee?
Yeah, again, thank you, Jen, for that. I think that characterization that it's binary, right, that it's the NGO community against the markets, I think it's misguided. I think where the misalignment exists is that there's a miscommunication. But I think, and certainly I think I speak for many in this room, I think we are very aligned with regards to how we value nature. Right? You outlined that earlier, Jen, around the quotient in terms of representation of carbon credits that are coming from nature. I don't think that that's a sort of outlier there. It's a reality. We're placing a value here, and we're leveraging a separate tool, which is the market, to help to channel the finance where it's necessary. And so I think they're synergistic. I just think that there's potentially a lack of education with regards to the power of markets from NGOs, and I think we certainly help to breach that gap oftentimes when we speak to a lot of our friends and NGOs, and I think it's very powerful. But to sort of conclude, Jen, you mentioned earlier, from the compensations sort of angle, we're not going to do it through philanthropy, quite frankly. We're just not able to scale that effectively, whereas markets have demonstrated across a plethora of different sort of markets that they can, right? Like they can actually channel finance. So I think it's we need to bridge that gap effectively.
Esme, as BP as a company is often the target of NGO campaigns, right? So how have you been discussing this internally about how you're going to be putting forward claims about carbon compensation, and maybe, and this is a question for the wider panel, maybe considering partnering with some NGOs on some campaigns or to promote certain things on the market that you could both sign up to. This is something that we're seeing more and more in Brussels, these kinds of joint communication campaigns between NGOs and industry players. Is that something you've been hearing or considering?
From a BP perspective, our so we've got a 2050 net zero target. We've got near-term targets, and those near-term targets are focused on operational reductions. We're not using credits to meet our near-term targets, and the discussions around what we would potentially be doing beyond those near-term targets is still one that's ongoing internally. So
yeah, something you'd rather not communicate on. Let me turn to the floor. I see lots of people already raising their hands. So if we could get a microphone, yes, here in the front.
Thank you very much, Kemal Armada from Climeworks. I'd like to say that I'm a carbon markets person, so I'm pro-markets, and I really agree with Jan's statement that those who are active in the markets are more likely to decarbonize. But I never heard anyone talk about net zero in this panel. And for net zero, we have SBTi, and SBTi has very well outlined guidance. As part of that, for credit utilization, they have beyond value chain mitigation guidance. And now they're coming up with Scope 3 potential expansion for carbon credit utilization. And I also didn't hear discussion around difference between removal and emission reduction credits. How do the panel think about the distinction between those two types of credits? And how do you all think that market should scale and each of those credits, the role of each of those credits?
René, it seems you want to take that one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there was an obfuscation here. Like, we weren't avoiding that conversation, but it is the EU policy framework that we're trying to focus on. So, I mean, we've tried to allude to it, but yeah, Jen just outlined the Oxford principles, right? And I really subscribe to that approach as well, because it's a transition hierarchy, right? We commented on the fact that removals are an essential component, and yes, I'll concede, it is to achieve the net zero component, right? But today, they're at the infancy with regards to the technology, and so it needs to achieve scale effectively, and we've seen it before with regards to, let's say, photovoltaics, right? They follow a natural curve, and we need to see that compression with regards to pricing, but we also need to see the other side of the coin, the avoidance credits, increase in price. If they don't, then the spread is far too wide. And so we need both, effectively, is the solution from a market perspective and from a climate perspective. Anything else you guys would like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that, we definitely can't ignore the 15% of global emissions that today come from land conversion, right? And so we will not get to net zero, to your point, until we stop mowing down the forest, right? So that is, that's sort of, to me, job one. And the methods and the sort of techniques and the methodologies and the registries were sort of set up today to scale that piece. And that's not to say we shouldn't also be simultaneously investing in the removals. We should, but they're going to need time to climb down the cost curve and up the availability axis.
Okay, more questions from the audience? Here in the middle.
Hello, everyone. I'm Carla Zorzanelli with NBS Brazil Alliance. We are a non-profit alliance, and our members represent more than 70% of all carbon credits of nature-based solutions in Brazil. And my question is, I would like to know, from your point of view, the green claims, do you believe that somehow that will bring some kind of demotivation towards the market, towards companies, or it would be like the other way around, push them to work harder? And plus, do you believe if the green claims comes around, if that will impact the purchase of carbon credits, specifically in nature-based solutions? Thank you.
Okay. Georgia, you want to take this?
I'll try and take that one. I mean, first off, just with green claims, I think we need to be really cautious about making any long-term bets on it yet, in that we've just seen a communication come out from the council last week, which doesn't have this like-for-like principle in it. There's no mention of the requirement to offset or to balance out fossil fuel emissions with permanent removals. So I just have a real hesitation of making any major long-term bet on green claims. What I would say, though, is, and again, to our experience and talking to buyers, and particularly, obviously, we're global, but we, our European buyers, this is top and center of their minds. I, as a policy person, am much more involved in client calls because they're really, really interested how the policy could impact their action and what they're doing. And yes, I think, quite frankly, it is a bit of a staller right now. But to come back to what I said earlier, I'm really hoping that things will evolve, questions will be answered this year, and that we can sort of carry on and keep momentum going while that bit of policy is worked through. Does that answer your question? Did anyone else want to comment?
Others want to say a word maybe about green claims specifically?
No, I mean, I think you said it, right? The jury's still out. We don't know what it's going to look like. There's a world in which it could and a world in which it might not.
Yeah. Okay, more questions there towards the back.
Thanks, Simon. Great panel. Simon Paulson-Jones from Emerald Carbon. What can the EU learn from the US, and what can the US learn from the EU on policy? And where does IOSCO fit in all of this?
In terms of credits?
So EU policy, regulate it, US policy, throw money at it and have some disclosure. IOSCO published proposals on how to regulate the VCM globally as a global standard setter, but no mention of IOSCO and where that might fit in EU regulatory policy going forwards.
Does anyone want to say something about it, Georgia?
I'm sure Jen have views too. I mean, we, again, I think quite an interesting position in Patch because we're global. So we have obviously American operations and we have European operations. I actually think about this a lot, seeing two very distinct ways of tackling or sort of trying to build scale in carbon markets. To give you some really practical examples, I think something that is happening in the US with the DOE and their public procurement program is very, very interesting. I think it's a bit of a prediction. My guess is we'll see more public procurement from governments, both in the UK and in the EU. I think that's a really good model to drive scale and build confidence. So I think that's something very tangible from us to learn from the US. And then I'd say the other one is around not over-regulating at the beginning. Yes, regulation has a key role to play, but don't try and answer every question at the outset. Regulation is a very slow tool, especially for iteration, innovation. So I think we regulate what we absolutely have to, and we leave the rest to learn as we go. And I think the US are more on that side.
And I think the other thing that's happening in the US is the development of regional markets, right? And so in California, for example, I think I mentioned the disclosures. I think a focus, to your point on not over-regulating, a disclosure framework is something that, certainly the EU might adopt. And then on the other side, in talking with colleagues who have been interacting directly with the legislators in California, it's clear that those California legislators are looking right now to the EU and to the Green Claims Directive because they are thinking about how and whether and what to do about their own claims process, which to me, you know, I would not like to see that because I've already sort of described the issues that, that I see in the current iteration of the Green Claims Directive.
Okay, more questions. I see hand raised there at the back.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to stand up. I think you're quite blinded over there. So hello, thanks very much for the discussion. Benya here from Carbon Market Watch, so here to push back on a few things and also bring in the NGO perspective. So Jen, I was curious to hear about your thoughts on the flaws of the compensation model, because I think personally that, and also in line with what Carbon Market Watch's work has been doing, that the compensation model as it is right now is so flawed, and in this critical decade of climate action, we really don't have time to waste. So I'm wondering, like, how will you manage to get the design flaws, the quality flaws, everything that is connected to the compensation model out of the system? And also, how do you see the contribution model? Maybe that's more of a comment and not a question. I would say the contribution model is not philanthropy. It's just not misleading in a way that it opens up to more means of climate finance. It opens up to more than carbon credits and kind of gives this perspective of carbon credits not being the only holy grail of climate finance, right? And that's something we can all agree on. So I think in that sense, the contribution model has a potential here. And I think naturally the second step would be also then to have a company carbon neutrality claim in line with the upcoming EU policy framework, because frankly, it doesn't really make sense to have Nestle saying that they're a climate neutral company, but while they're banned of selling carbon neutral coffee. It just doesn't make sense from a consumer protection perspective. So yeah, I was just reflecting back on those, and I think a third and last thing that I wanted to say is like that the studies that are being brought up a couple of times now, it's really important to understand that they are demonstrating correlation and not a causation. There's a lot of different factors that can bring those two things together: internal decarbonization and the purchase of carbon credits. And I think it's really important to look at different things like financial resources, the natural education of companies in market structures, whether renewable energy certificates have been counted towards the emissions, whether all scopes are included in those studies. I think they are not. So I think it's important to kind of critically reflect on those as well.
Okay, thank you. Renee, I saw that you maybe wanted to answer that or react.
Well, yeah, I just thought you were going to pile on Jen. I'd come in and give it back up. Do you want me to go first?
Sure.
Yeah, cool. Look, I just think that it's misleading where you're coming from. The data, look, men lie, women lie, numbers don't, right? And the data indicates that taking voluntary action on climate, purchasing carbon credits, can actually price an externality and create a signal inside an organization to decarbonize. I don't know where I'm not being clear on that. There's an ideological battle that's being fought here, which I don't think, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, we don't have time. So I just ask for the NGO community, look, this carbon markets is a solution. It is a voluntary market. If corporates want to buy them, they should be able to, albeit trying to strive for the highest stringency and highest quality, right? The compensation versus the contribution claims, I just think, I disagree. I just don't think that I think compensation is scalable and contributions is not, and it is akin to philanthropy, in my view. I just think, where is the incentive? And incentives drive behavior. If you're a corporate, this is a balance sheet exercise. You have liabilities with regards to emissions, and the carbon credits provide the counterbalance to that. It's not that they're trying to greenwash. I think you guys made that point, but I think what we're trying to do here is to leverage climate finance to where it can happen and make impact. And with that in absence, inaction is the only thing that occurs.
Okay, I think we're getting closer to the end, and I wanted to take, yes, there was this gentleman there who wanted to ask a question, please.
Yeah, my name is Lukman Issa. I'm a carbon market researcher at BTU Corpus, Germany. Yeah, I'm like trying to think through the panel. So I'm like, trying to look at the onerous interventions that is coming to the market due to the greenwash concerns and all of that. Then my question is like, how do we create incentive? Because market is a very powerful thing, and it has the ability to punish the bad practitioner and to disincentivize greenwashing and all of that. So how do we explore market to do that? Because these interventions, if they are so onerous in the way they are, they might be stifling investment, and I agree with Georgia on that. So how do we like explore market to create these incentives to disincentivize greenwashing and bad practice?
I'm not sure I fully understood, but
I think if I've thank you for your question. I think if I've understood you, how do we strike that balance between not stifling investment and scaling investment, but also ensuring that there is rigor and that we aren't going through greenwashing? Is that right? I mean, obviously, I would say, you know, patch helps. No, I think more broadly, I think, you know, we've said across all of us that we all really, really understand and recognize that trust and transparency is critical to scaling this market. And that's where we're coming from. That's why we're facing a lot of these challenges today, because of the concern and the concern that people have in it. And I think there's many different ways to build up that trust and transparency, lots of tools in the toolkit. They come from disclosure, as Jen has mentioned, as a big one. You know, we've got this, we've got the CSRD at European level with the ESRS technical reporting guidelines underneath that, which will require companies to describe how they're buying credits, what they're doing with them, what kind of credits, what they're saying about them. So I think disclosure is key. I think education is critical. A lot of corporates, quite understandably, don't necessarily know what each project means. What does X project or Y project really refer to? What impact can it have? So I think education and corporates leaning into understanding different types of projects is incredibly important, so they know what they're buying. So that education part, I think, as I've said previously, aligning behind scientific guidance will bring kind of simplicity and, you know, consolidation amongst all the many different rules. And then, you know, there's a big role here to be played by software, by all of the other tools that we have around supporting project suppliers in modernizing how they track, communicate, monitor, sell their credits, so that that data can be captured, can be verified, can be checked, so that we all understand what that is. So I think the technology role is key there too. I'm trying to think of any others of bringing trust and transparency, but I think it's really important. All of these things, we need all of those.
Okay, thanks. I think we've reached the end of the time that we had, so thanks a lot to our speakers for participating today. Thanks to the audience, and certainly we'll keep an eye out for developments there at Carbon Pulse. So, yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.